Well, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, thank you. I'm Joe Hunt, Engineering 62, and on behalf of the Northeastern at Noon Committee, as well as the Office of Alumni Relations, I'd like to welcome you all here today. And I also want to give a special thanks to the Double Husky Scholarship, who have been kind enough to sponsor the streaming session that we have today. Now, today's subject, of course, is investigative reporting in a short attention span world. So I thought, what better way to begin a session with this subject matter than to give a pop investigative quiz. But don't worry, your grades, your answers will not count to your grades at the end of the semester. The first question I'd like to ask is, and please raise your hand, how many of you get news from digital media, either your computer or your tablet or your iPhone or whatever? Raise your hands. Quite a few of you. How many of you get news from print media? Magazines, newspapers? Hey, an equal number, maybe a little more. How many of you get news from television, either by cable or by right through the airwaves? Boy, almost everyone. Finally, how many of you get news from some other source I haven't mentioned, like radio or word of mouth? Wow, what a response. I think you can see from this little quiz that if I ask you how many get your news from more than one source, maybe even all that I've mentioned, raise your hands. Okay, it looks unanimous. And I think what we've demonstrated here is that there is a lot of competition in the news field for your attention because you have so many choices. And that is one of the things that investigative reporters have to deal with. And as the title of our presentation suggests, there is also another factor, short attention span, and multiple sources may be something that contributes to that. Now, in addition to that, though, I was alerted to another possible difficulty in the field, and that is from a very brief article in Sunday's Globe written by Mark Feeney. And he talks about the 3 movies that have been made from the Dan Brown novels. And if you remember, he wrote The Da Vinci Code, Angels and Demons, and Inferno. And every one of those has been made into a movie. And every one is of the same genre, and every one of them stars Tom Hanks. Yet, over the years, as each movie is released, they get shorter and shorter. For example, The Da Vinci Code ran 149 minutes. Angels and Demons ran 138 minutes. And the current movie, Inferno, is down to 121 minutes. Now, there may be many factors involved here, but one of them could be that we are developing a cultural attention span disorder, maybe something for an investigative report. But in any case, I think we see and realize that there are many factors that influence how investigative reporting is done and passed on to those who need the news. And we're very happy today to have as our speaker one who is intimately involved in this field, Mike Beaudet, who you may recognize. He's as an investigative reporter who has worked in television for more than 20 years. He's a multimedia investigative reporter at WCVB-TV in Boston, where he works as part of the 5 Investigates team. He received his bachelor's degree from Emerson College, went on to receive a master's degree from Northeastern University. He's taught at both Emerson and at Northeastern before joining Northeastern as a professor of the practice back in 2014. He started his career in radio, as many in the field do, covering politics at the Massachusetts State House. Then he went on to make several stops at television stations in Bangor, Maine, and in Manchester, New Hampshire. He eventually joined WCVB-TV as an investigative journalist, as well as anchor of WFXT-TV, that's Fox 25, as an anchor. He has become known over the years for his hard-hitting investigations which specialize in stories on government waste and corruption. And if I may interject, I think that's an area that will keep you busy for many, many years. Over the years, you won't be surprised to learn that he's won numerous awards, including 16 New England Emmy Awards. And this year, 2016, he won the New England Emmy for Outstanding Investigative Report for a composite of stories, 2 of which were produced by Northeastern students who were members of his class on investigative reporting. Finally, I want to note that his reporting has been recognized repeatedly by the Associated Press, as well as the Radio, Television, Digital News Association. So with that, and before anyone can change channels, let me introduce Mike Beaudet and give him a warm welcome. Good to see you.
I'm going to try to pull this out of here. Thank you so much for that nice introduction. I appreciate it. Thank you all for being here. This is great to see so many of you and so many Huskies, because I do have that Northeastern connection, not only teaching there, but also a graduate of the university. And I hope that you folks get out to the Boston campus, because I think you'll see such a transformation over the years, and it really continues. I can tell you about the School of Journalism, and we're continuing to do renovations there and really try to go with the times and prepare journalists for the future to be dealing with, yes, this short attention span world that we're dealing with, and having them to get the skills that they need to actually produce quality journalism. So please, if you haven't gone to the Boston campus, you should definitely make a trip there and check it out. So I appreciate this opportunity to talk to you folks about what I do, and I also want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions, because I know a lot of you will want to talk about the state of news and how it's changed. And it was so interesting to see all of you raise your hands and talk about the different ways that you get your news and information, because I think that that's a reality. And don't mind me, I'm going to walk around. I learned this little trick because a lot of times I teach 8 a.m. classes. And if I don't move around and basically have a 3-ring circus at 8 a.m., you know what the students are doing. They're sleeping. So I like to move around and keep the conversation going. So this is a reality for investigative journalism now. We are dealing with a short attention span world where people are being bombarded with so much information. And there's pressure everywhere to get that audience, and we're going to look at some stats here in a little bit about how the audience is being splintered and how the ability to get them to watch you on TV or to pick up your newspaper is becoming more and more challenging. And so I think in the face of that, as journalists, one of the things we have to be very cognizant of is we want to attract an audience, yes, but we also want to continue to produce quality journalism that matters to people out there like you, so that you folks are engaged, but that we're also engaging the people that are coming up the line as our news consumers, people in their 20s, people in their 30s, and getting them to care about this information and not just social media. So you pretty much heard about my background, so I won't repeat it again, but I'm a proud Northeastern Husky. Went back there to get my master's because I knew that I wanted to teach journalism. And after graduating in 2008, began teaching at both Emerson and Northeastern. And then I was lucky enough to join the faculty full-time in 2014 in the School of Journalism. I also left Fox 25 after about 20 years, just about a year ago. And that enabled me to go to WCVB and work 3 days a week. And then I'm able to be at Northeastern at least 2 days a week to do classes and other assignments. So it's really, I feel like I'm so blessed to have this opportunity to stay in the business and stay current, but also teach the next generation of journalists. So you can't talk about journalism, any journalism, I think, right now, and not acknowledge the story that's on everyone's mind. What's the story that's on everyone's mind? The election. I was talking to someone out in the audience before about early voting. Yes, I had to put that out there, like only the New York Post could capture the Donald and Hillary Clinton. But doesn't that just sum up this election? Who's ready for this to be over with? Less than 2 weeks, less than 2 weeks. But I was talking with someone about the fact that there's early voting now in Massachusetts. Show of hands, who's participated in early voting? So a handful of you. And I think it's great that we have that opportunity to do it. But I was talking with my wife this morning about the process, and we looked it up, and we can go to the town hall and we can do it. And then I said, you know what, I want to feel like I'm participating on the day of the election. Even if the line's a little long, I'm looking forward to showing up and actually voting on that particular day. But yes, the election is obviously a big story, and I think it ties into this short attention span. I know it's a little hard for everyone to read, so I'm going to just repeat it, but length of political sound bites on network TV in 1968. Any guesses how long you think political sound bites were in 1968 on the network news? 20 seconds? Any other guesses? 10 seconds? 2 minutes? So 1968, the average soundbite was 43 seconds long on network TV. So let's flash forward to 1988. Still quite a long time ago, 1988. But from 1968, with 43 seconds long, what do we think it went down to in 1988? 20 seconds? 9 seconds. To me, that just sums up what we're dealing with here, is how the news has changed over the years. It's interesting. I got this information from National Public Radio, and they talked with a Boston Globe reporter who did a story about the length of sound bites. And what he talked about was the fact that in 1992, CBS News saw this stat, saw it went from 43 to 9 seconds long, and thought, we got to do something about it. Why are we having 9-second sound bites? And so during 92, which was the election when the United States brought the other Clinton into office, remember that? So we had Ross Perot, we had George Bush, and we had Bill Clinton. They made a commitment, CBS News, to only putting on sound bites that were 30 seconds long. They said they were going to do it. Well, it turns out it failed miserably because the politicians were used to talking in these short sound bites. And so this experiment that sounded good didn't work. And so those sound bites, I hope they're not shorter than 9 seconds long, because what can someone say in less than 9 seconds? But the point being, we've become accustomed as a culture to things being shorter and being delivered in a shorter amount of time. And I think it's only gotten worse as we have progressed and technology has increased. I know you just talked about all the different ways, whether it's digital, TV, newspaper, but let's talk about specifically, where do you turn to for news? I'd like to hear just some ideas. For those who read the newspaper, what newspapers are you reading? Boston Globe, Paper Record, New York Times, Wall Street Journal. What about for television? Let's go with network television. CBS, Channel 5. I hope we're hearing some Channel 5. That goes without saying. Fox Network or 25 local? 25, right. So any other TV? GBH. And then what about digital media? Any sort of new media that you're turning to? CNN Online? Anyone else? BBC. I mean, that's one of the nice things about the internet, is that it opens up all these news sources to us that we wouldn't have necessarily had access to before. So there really are a lot of pluses to technology. But the point being, we're getting more and more and more choices. So I'm going to just walk you through this, because this was a survey that was done by Pew Research. They look at the state of the media every year. And essentially what it's saying is looking at how things changed in 2014 to 2015. And I know it's a little tough to see, but just look at the arrows. In general, all those arrows are facing which way? They're facing down. So we have newspapers from 2015 versus 2014, circulation down 7%. Cable TV, that's actually a little bit of a bright spot, up 8%, average viewership of primetime news on cable. So that's when we're talking about the CNNs, the Fox News Channel, the MSNBC. Network TV, so those are your more traditional news broadcasts, a little up, 1% up on the evening news, but the morning news was actually 2% down. And then we look at local TV, my bread and butter, late night news down 5%, morning and early viewership down 2%. And if you were to look at a chart that showed where things were 10 years ago or 20 years ago, that arrow is going down in general. That's the trend line. Whether it's newspapers, whether it's sort of the traditional TV, it's heading in that direction. And I think it just raises the question, where are those news consumers going? Do we think that people don't care about news anymore? You folks care about it. I saw that when you were all raising your hands and talking about all the sources of news that you go to. Where do you think the news consumers are going? Twitter? Does anyone use Twitter here? I'm hearing crickets. What about Facebook? We've got some people on Facebook, but that's it. They're going online. They're using social media. They're finding ways, other ways, to get their news and information. And if you talk to some of the veterans in my business, in the news business, they don't want to deal with social media. They don't want to deal with Twitter. They don't want to deal with Facebook. Snapchat, have you guys heard of Snapchat? They don't want to deal with Snapchat. Instagram, who knows what's next? I hear about it from my students when they're on the next app that I'm like, okay, I better at least figure out what these things are. But there's a lot of veterans in the news business who really don't want to deal with this. And what I say to them is, you've got to deal with it. You've got to embrace it. You've got to find a way to connect with the audience because we're searching for that audience. It doesn't mean we do silly news. It doesn't mean we do stories about flying squirrels. It means we find a way to engage the audience but embrace the technology. And I think the people that do that and do it well are going to be the ones who are successful. And it's the only way that we're going to be able to continue doing the stories we want to do, the in-depth stories we want to do, but finding a way to make it matter to a younger audience. So you said it right there. Where are they going? They're going to their phones. I mean, this is how people are getting their news. I mean, someone on campus yesterday as I was walking around almost ran right into me because people don't look up from their phones. Don't get me started on the texting and driving in Massachusetts. I actually did a story with the students at Northeastern and showed how Massachusetts is one of those few states where, yes, it's illegal to text and drive, but we don't make it illegal to hold your phone in your hand. We haven't gone hands-free. And so therefore, police can't tell if you're texting or you're on the phone or what you're doing. And so the law is largely ineffective. And we did a story on that with the students. But I digress. The point being, this is how people are getting their news and information. And who are journalists competing against? Anyone watch 60 Minutes? I don't know if you saw on Sunday a piece that I was really fascinated about. Social media influencers. Did anyone see this piece? So interesting and eye-opening. So Kim Kardashian. I don't get Kim Kardashian. I don't get it. But 48.7 million followers on Twitter. 48.7 million followers. I don't get her, but I would love to have that sort of audience listening to my stories. And basically, the 60 Minutes piece showed that people like Kim Kardashian are reaching a huge audience, and they're becoming very valuable because of that, and that advertisers are wanting them to do product placements. And Dunkin' Donuts, for example, this guy, I hadn't heard of this guy until the 60 Minutes piece. His name's Logan Paul. the dumbest Dunkin' Donuts ad you've ever seen, where he's got a rubber Dunkin' Donut around him. It's got millions of hits, and Dunkin' Donuts is happy because the young people are talking about it. He's on the cover of Adweek. I mean, this guy is a marketing machine, and he told 60 Minutes, yeah, I made a couple $100,000, but I'm worth much more. And you know what? He's probably right, because he is actually reaching all those people. So this is what we're competing against. Yes, we want their audience, but I don't want to be on TV with the big rubber donut floatable device. I just don't think that's going to work it's not going to work for me, but it's not going to work for the credibility of our business. So we talk about journalism. Is all hope lost for journalism? Well, what do you guys think? I mean, some of this can be depressing when you think about it. Are we in trouble? Is journalism in trouble? Kind of.
Well, somebody has to pay for the reporters to come and do their job. People that are accessing it online.
Right. You're hitting on, he makes the point that someone has to pay for journalism, and it's right. Journalists need to get paid. I mean, it's not a profession for everyone, but I love it, but I also have to, pay the bills and feed my family and pay the mortgage. And so journalists have to get paid, but what's happening online is that people just want to access stuff for free. They're online. Why should I pay Boston Globe? Why should I pay New York Times for a subscription when I can go to Google News and hope that I can get through the paywall? So there's so many variables, and you have the newspaper industry. I mean, it started with the newspaper industry and really the classified ads going away because they were replaced by Craigslist. You want to sell something, you post it on Craigslist. And so they were losing all this revenue, and circulation goes down. And so the journalism industry as a whole is absolutely facing financial hurdles. And I can tell you in my newsroom alone, they talk about ways, how can we have audience engagement? How can we go on Twitter? How can we go on Facebook and get that viral video? And I'm going to be honest with you, I understand it, but sometimes I have to step back and say to my colleagues, I want the audience of Kim Kardashian. I want the millions, but I'm not going to do silly things to get it. And so I think that's the balancing act that journalism is facing right now. And I think specifically with investigative journalism, we think of ourselves, fairly or not, we like to think of ourselves in the investigative units as people who are taking a little more time on stories, that we're not just having to go out there and cover something that's going to be on the 6 o'clock news. We're going to take a few days and hopefully put together a piece that's a little more in-depth. And so I think we especially don't want to be doing silly things, but I think I can speak for all my colleagues at WCVB, and really, in fairness, all my colleagues that work in this market. When I worked at Fox, no one wants to be doing sort of, clickbait, they call it, things that are going to get, the clicks, but not have the real content behind it. So, going back to that question, is all hope lost? I don't think it is. I really don't think it is. I think journalism is alive and well. I think investigative journalism is alive and well, but I think because we have so many sources and so many places we can go to get that news, we have to be more informed consumers. You have to be informed consumers. You have to seek out those newspapers like the Boston Globe, like the New York Times, like the Wall Street Journal that are still doing like really robust investigative reporting, that are putting the resources into it, the Washington Post, or the television stations. I mean, I'm not trying to toot my own horn, but I will for a minute, because I think WCVB has really made a commitment to investigative journalism. We have the largest investigative television unit in the city. We have 3 incredible reporters, myself, Kathy Curran, and Karen Anderson. We have 3 producers behind the scenes, Kevin Rothstein and Jonathan Wells. Those 2 guys I worked with at Fox as well, and an executive producer, 2 photographers. It's a big commitment when you think about the resources that they're putting into it when they're facing, financial constraints. So I think it's incumbent on consumers to seek out those places that are trying to do good investigative journalism. Storytelling, it matters, but we're also facing the pressure. We talked about the sound bites being shorter. When I was at Fox, how long do you think my stories were over at Fox? We had the hour at 10, so we had a little more time to play with as opposed to just a half hour, but any idea how long an investigative piece in local TV would be? 3 was actually short. I'm still adjusting to 3 minutes. We were usually over in the 5-minute range. I could sometimes push it to maybe 6. I think we even had an 8-minute story on once, which would be unheard of today. You know, no one would allow me to put an 8-minute story on television. Whereas at Channel 5, they prefer 2:30, but I don't really like that rule. I think, you know, we need to be in the 3-minute, 3:30 range. And then when we have stories that I think really matter and really need more in-depth times, we'll do different things. We'll try to split them up and put, you know, part of the story in one newscast and then try to tell people to come back at 7 o'clock and watch another 3-minute piece. So we're trying to find creative ways to still get the information out there while at the same time trying to, you know, keep that pace up that people want. You know, I think we need to give our audience more credit, and when I say this we, I mean all television journalists and newspaper journalists and all journalists. I don't think the audience can't handle a long story or can't handle a long article. I think they can, but we need to make it interesting enough for them and give them credit. I think you guys would sit through a 6-minute piece. Wouldn't you sit through a 6-minute piece if the topic was good? But there's that fear that people are going to tune out, that people aren't going to watch for the whole thing. And so I think, you know, that's the challenge, is we have to provide the content that's good so people will watch, but we also have to give our audience credit that they're actually, you know, not walking around in some sort of short attention span haze that I think sometimes people think. Oh, if we don't have 50 stories in a particular newscast, then people are just going to start drooling and, you know, fall asleep. I don't believe that's true. I think you can handle longer stories as long as we're giving you good information. At the same time, I go back to what I said a few minutes ago about is all hope lost and how some of the veterans in my business don't want to use social media, don't want to do Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, Instagram, whatever it is. And I think you have to find new ways to engage the audience because they're not sitting down. If I go to my students and I say, who's watched the 6 o'clock news? It would be crickets. 10 o'clock news, 11 o'clock news, no one. They do not sit down and turn on the TV to watch news. Some of them might if it's related to an assignment, and then you might have a few journalism students that are interested in TV, so they might. But in general, they want news on demand. And I think that's what we need to be giving them. And I think we're going to see more of that. Yes, the websites are getting better, but they need to be even better. They need to be in a way that people can go on, have a menu, and click, 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 and they're going to almost create their own newscast. That's what I would like to be able to offer on some sort of app or website. All right, social media. I try to embrace it. These are a little hard to see, but I did some stories recently on DCR, the Department of Conservation and Recreation. Any DCR folks in here or know anyone who works at DCR? Did you work there? Or? Oh, okay, good. I didn't want you throwing anything at me for doing like a DCR story. Oh, good. So we did a story a few weeks back. I don't know if you guys heard about the July 3rd party that the commissioner and the assistant commissioner at DCR held over in the Back Bay. And it was a private affair, but they were inviting a lot of the higher-ups in state government. And essentially, they were using state resources. The state had rented golf carts, and they were, you know, whisking the people over from the Back Bay home of a prominent Republican and over to the hatch shell and into the VIP section. And so we had gotten a tip about this and started looking into it. And of course, when we first asked DCR about it, they said, oh no, there's no story here. And I kept calling back, where are my documents, where are my records? And eventually, there we got the records, and they actually suspended both the commissioner and the assistant commissioner for the improper use of the funds. But that just spiraled. It wasn't the end of it. And so what you're seeing here is a tweet. So I go on Twitter, I go on Facebook, and I try to engage the audience. And in the wake of that original story we did on the party, we had received some video from a source which showed the assistant commissioner actually using his lights and sirens on a state vehicle to get through traffic. So one of the cases, there wasn't even any traffic. I think he just like playing with the lights and sirens because he had them. In another case, there was traffic. And so we got this video, and ultimately the state forced him to resign from that position. So this was how I was trying to engage the audience, because I thought, okay, we got some video. And so on Twitter, it says the video that forced a top state official to resign. And then you could, play that video and you'd hear the sirens and seeing the guy going through. So finding a way in, sort of that 10-second moment to hopefully engage the audience and get them. In this particular one, I wanted them to tune into our newscast at 7. But then we'll do other tweets and Facebook posts where we're actually trying to link them to the story. So we're not counting on them just to tune into the newscast. This is another one we did last week on flaggers. You guys remember Deval Patrick came in 2008 and really pushed the idea that we're going to use civilian flaggers in Massachusetts as opposed to police details. And a couple months back, I was saying, where are the flaggers? I haven't seen a flagger in I don't know when. And so we started looking into it, and MassDOT insisted that the flagger program is still active. It's going really well. I went on the website, and they were bragging about it. And they had a map. And they said all these active flagger projects. And then we went out there to the sites listed. One of them in Brockton was built in 2011, completed, no flaggers in sight, but they're bragging about this on their website. And so we ended up getting some of the numbers, and the short story of it is, police detail costs higher than ever, and the flagger program not really working. The state says, well, there's some construction projects, and it's true, on the highway, speeds above 45 miles an hour, where you wouldn't want a civilian flagger. But there are plenty of projects, and I'm sure you've all driven by them. A lot of times, a lot of people said to me afterward, too, you're like, yeah, I always see the cops out there, and they're actually just sitting on their phone, not doing much. But regardless, there are certainly many projects that civilian flaggers could be used. And so this was a way, picture's a little hard to see, but it says police officer ahead, and the tweet was, so when's the last time you saw a civilian flagger in Massachusetts? Is Deval Patrick's reform now dead? Which some people, when Deval Patrick was in office, he gave me such a hard time for the stories we would do on his administration. And I always said I couldn't wait until we had a Republican governor, because I don't care if it's a Republican in office or a Democrat in office. I'm thinking that I'm on the side of all of us, the taxpayers. And if someone's wasting money or promising a reform that's not going to be done, then we're going to hold them accountable. And as you said, I don't think we're ever going to run out of stories here in Massachusetts. I really don't. So we asked Deval Patrick. I thought, all right, this would be a great opportunity to see if the former governor would like to speak with us, but he turned me down. So he didn't want to comment. But this was a way we were trying to engage the audience. Again, the story was on at 5 o'clock, and we were trying to engage. Facebook is another way. This was actually, you guys should check out this if you haven't seen. The state comptroller, Tom Shack, has a new program. Some of you has anyone heard of Open Checkbook? So it's on the state's website, and it's a way to look up how the state is spending. But there's this new program that just came online, and we did a story on it. It's called See-Through, C-T-H-R-U. But if you look up the state comptroller's office, you'll be able to go on there. And it is a really robust wealth of information about all state spending, all salaries. And so we did a story on it, just trying to tell the public that it was out there. But I was, again, trying to engage the public here. And up there I wrote, we already did some number crunching, but there's much more to be done. So let us know if you find anything interesting. And so please, if you guys go to See-Through, let me know if you find anything interesting. But we're continuing to do that. But that was a way, again, trying to engage the audience and hopefully generate more stories. So I don't think all hope is lost. I think essentially we just need to find a way to keep using the technology to our benefit and not thinking we have all the answers. I mean, I think that's the bottom line is I don't have all the answers. I don't think anyone has all the answers. I often ask my students, what would it take to get you to be more engaged in the news and want to read stories and want to watch broadcasts? And they always say content. They want good content. And so I think that's the same, whether you're 18 or 65 or somewhere in between. I think everyone wants good content. And I think that as journalists and as educators of journalists, we need to stress that. How we deliver it's changing. The TV business is changing. The newspaper business is changing. But it all comes back to good content. One of the ways we're trying to evolve at Northeastern, and I hope all of you got the article about the public records test, but one of the things I'm proud of is that we have continued on. We used to have Walter Robinson from the Boston Globe came back to Northeastern. He's one of our proud graduates of Northeastern who's done remarkably well and was at the Globe for years, is the main character in Spotlight. I hope you guys saw Spotlight, the movie. Great movie, just inspiring and makes you think that journalism does still matter. Walter Robinson, Robbie as we call him, came back to Northeastern and started teaching. And when I was there for my master's degree, I actually had him. I took his investigative journalism class just because I wanted to, I could sit there and listen to his stories for hours. I mean, this guy has some amazing stories. But he started a partnership with the Boston Globe in which students were engaged in investigations and working on stories that appeared in the Globe. And over his tenure there, they did dozens of them. In 2014, he went back to the Globe, and that's when Northeastern hired me full-time. And I've been working first with Fox 25, now with WCVB, but we've also done stories with the Globe, as you'll see there, and teaching an investigative journalism class for undergrads and graduate students, and getting them involved in the process of really digging into stories, chasing down leads. They've done all sorts of, they've done undercover work. They've done all sorts of things depending on the particular story we worked on. But the public records one we worked on with the Globe last fall. And essentially what we did is we had a student, we wanted to test the system, all the cities and towns, and see if they'll really reply and comply with the public records law on time. So the way the law works, within 10 days, they're supposed to give you some sort of meaningful response. And as an investigative journalist, I can tell you a lot of times the state agencies who we deal with more do all sorts of things to delay you. First of all, they just don't return your calls. Or they throw huge bills at you, $20,000. Oh, sure, we'll give you those records. I've had $70,000, $70,000. Am I going to pay that? No. I mean, we're not going to pay that. And so there are different ways that they operate and try to, I would argue, block the information from being out there. So public records reform was underway in Massachusetts, under debate last year, if you'll recall. They did end up passing it after this story appeared. And what we did was we sent out letters to every town hall, every police department, 351 cities and towns, and this was the students who did this. It was a huge undertaking, I can tell you. I've never seen, as the replies started coming in and we were looking at all these emails and letters, we rented a post office box, it was a little daunting. But we did it from the perspective, we didn't want them to know we were journalists, we didn't want them to know we were students, so we took one of our students, Ben Thompson, and we had him, we used his name for all the letters. And so the cities and towns didn't know who Ben Thompson was. We picked his name because we thought it was generic enough that no one's going to really realize, if they look him up, they won't be able to figure it out. And so we tested them, and we found that in the majority of the cases, the cities and towns did not give us that meaningful response on time. Some did, some were great, but some weren't. And so it was more ammunition. And we have heard from some people that they believe that was the final sort of push that the legislature needed to pass the public records law. And so it's been passed, and now on January 1st, we do have some reforms in place. So this was an example of a story we did with the students. I will say on that front, I think Massachusetts does not go far enough, even though we have these reforms. Do you realize that our legislature is exempt from the public records law? So that means if we want to get anything from the legislature, they tell us we're exempt. That's crazy. How can our lawmakers be exempt from the public records law? It's coming up right now in my investigative class where we're trying to get some records from the House and Senate. I won't say which ones because it's to be continued on a story, but they said, nope, we're not going to give them to you. And so it's a constant reminder that, yes, they passed some reform, but they don't really want to put the sunshine out there. And transparency, whether you think we should have access to text messages or not, or emails or not, I think transparency is a disinfectant for corruption. So I think the more transparency we have, the better off we ultimately are. At any rate, I do want to leave some time for questions, but I hope the message that I leave you with is that I do think, even though we're dealing with 100 televisions at once, so many sources of information bombarding us, that there are journalists out there that care about what we're doing, and we want to reach the audience. And I think, we're open to ideas on how to better do that. If you folks have ideas as well, I'd love to hear them. But I think that we need to continue to focus on telling good stories and in-depth journalism, and that's what I'm trying to do. So I appreciate you guys being here. Thank you. Question?
It's clear from your comments that the politicians are the enemy.
Not always.
My question is, how about your bosses? Have you run, don't give me any names, but have you run into bosses that say, that information, if it gets out, is unpalatable or unpleasant, and I wish you wouldn't follow that line of inquiry?
It's a good question. So he's asking, have I run into resistance from bosses who don't necessarily want to ruffle feathers about certain politicians, and that information, if it gets out there, is there pressure to not put that story out there? So I'll dodge a little on that, but I will say that I actually, during my master's studies at Northeastern, my master's thesis looked specifically at investigative journalists, television investigative journalists, and whether they felt pressure from their bosses to kill stories, so like to not do stories, or to water them down. And we did find, actually, and I had to keep it anonymous because obviously investigative journalists wouldn't talk to us because we focused on New England. I had a really good response rate where people were willing to talk if I gave them anonymity. And we did find time after time after time that people did feel pressure to either get rid of the story altogether or to water it down. And so that was a little alarming. The one thing we did discover, though, is that it really depended on the news organization and sort of the stomach that news managers have. I have to say, at every station that I've worked at, I have had news managers that have backed me up because I wouldn't be doing the type of stories that I do if I didn't. So I really do think it depends on the news organization. Have I had conversations with managers who want to know more about the story, who want to make sure that we've dotted every I and crossed every T? Absolutely. But at the end of the day, I want to make sure we've dotted every I and crossed every T. And if the story is a story, I've had their support. So I'm fortunate that I have had that, but I will absolutely acknowledge that I've talked to many colleagues who say that they haven't had that support, and that's unfortunate.
How do you differentiate between what should be, could be, or should not be disseminated? How do you take that into account and factor it in?
Good question. He's asking, how do we differentiate between what could be, what should be, and what shouldn't be put out there as a story? I mean, it's a judgment call. I think every day, you think about where do we get our stories from? And some of our best stories do come from tips. After I did that DCR story, I was flooded with a lot of tips. Some of them not very good, but some of them very good. So I think we have to evaluate the source of the story, the importance of the story, and I think a lot of that comes with experience, judgment. I tell my students who are young and they're starting out that you need to be discussing. None of these stories that we do, especially in investigative journalism, should be done in a vacuum. We shouldn't just be doing them on our own and making these decisions. We should be having conversations with our coworkers, our editors, our bosses about the process, how we're going to approach a certain story, to give us sort of that checks and balances. And I will say candidly that the way I evaluate a story today is different than when I was in my 20s, because I have that sort of, I think with experience comes judgment, as I think all of you would agree with. And so I think we need to make sure that even the younger journalists who are getting tips have experienced people around them that can decide what a story is. But on the other hand, we've got, I mean, I'll be working on, if you looked at my desk, it's a little messy, but I've got lots of folders and folder for every story. And on any given month, I might be working on 15 different stories. And one of them might gather dust for a while. Another one comes up to the forefront because there's something going on in the news. But it's always, it's sort of a give and take. And some of them never go anywhere. It's sort of that initial judgment I think of is this something, do people care about it? I mean, I think we do have to think about the audience engagement. A lot of people will call us with something that might be interesting, and I'll have to say, that's a story maybe for the town newspaper, but is the WCVB audience as a whole going to care about a particular topic? So there's a lot of judgment calls. And then sometimes you get pretty far along on a story that you think is good, and it's not so good. And so we decide for whatever reason, we're not going to do it. So I think it's really evaluating it and does it appeal to a lot of people. That's a little bit of tension too, because I've worked in some places and heard other people talk about sort of this broad appeal. And I agree that we want to reach a lot of people and we want to have stories that people are interested in, but I don't believe that every story has to necessarily impact you personally for you to care about it. When you think about the stories that you watch on TV that are just interesting, or you want to know about what's going on at the State House, or you want to know what's going on in some small town where there's corruption, because maybe that same type of corruption could be going on in my hometown. So sometimes the people who want to market the stories as opposed to the news people really want to be able to make it so everyone feels like they're personally impacted by the story. And I don't think that that's always the case. Again, we need to give our audience credit that they're going to be interested in a particular story. Question?
I find difficult is I kind of understand both sides. The news side, they want to get at the story, they want to get the information out, they want to make it interesting enough so somebody will pay attention to it. And then on the other side, you feel like sometimes when you talk to the media, they take what you say and they exaggerate it or they put a different slant on it. And just a simple example that I experienced myself. When I was at one of the universities, I was the director of HR, and I had a student newspaper representative from the student newspaper come to talk to me. And he wanted to talk about child care and whether we should have a child care facility on campus. And I talked about how we were looking into it and whatever. And the next student newspaper was that I was all for it, that the administration wouldn't support me. I mean, that's a simple example, but I think sometimes people are afraid to talk to the news because they don't know how the story will actually be predicted.
Right. So for those who didn't hear, she's basically saying, the two sides of it. Like we want an open press, but there's a fear among people if you talk to the media that somehow the story is going to get twisted. I hope it wasn't my student that went to you for that. Okay, because I'd fail him. But, it's unfortunate. I think there are people in my business, in any business, that give all of us a bad name. And so I think it's understandable if you've been burned by a reporter that you're going to be wary of talking to a reporter, and I get that. So it's hard. I mean, that's unfortunate that happened, but I think that's a real concern that people have, that they're going to be taken out of context. I always try to make the argument with TV, well, I can't really take you out of context. It's going to be harder for me because I'm going to have you talking on camera, so it's going to be harder to twist your words. But, that's unfortunate. I think it sort of gives us a bad name when people do that. I think most journalists are trying to do the right thing. Do I think there are preconceived ideas of a story? If you're going in and you're a general assignment reporter and you walk in there, you get your assignment and the assignment desk is saying it's about this, and then you get out there and find out it's about that, and so you got to be able to have that conversation. Again, I think, the more experienced journalists are better able to say, like, hey, wait a minute, it's not exactly what you thought, but it's still a decent story, or it's not exactly what you thought, let's move on to another story. So I think there is that sort of tension there, but hopefully most journalists aren't taking things out of context. And I think I think as a reporter too, you don't want people to think that you took something out of context. I mean, I think in investigative journalism, I don't do many stories where people aren't mad about something, I'll be honest. Like, I get the phone calls and the emails and the onslaught on social media, and it sort of comes with the territory. But I always think, like, if they're mad on both sides, then I'm doing something right. Kind of like, no one's happy with me. That must be a good thing. So I think it's balancing those two things.
In response to your comments about attention span for things, I for one find it very annoying that they start and get a teaser in regular news, at 6 o'clock, and then it's going to be followed up at 7.
Yes. Oh, do you find that annoying? Okay, talking about the tease, like something at 6.
They could sacrifice one of the weather reports and give you
I will deliver that message to my bosses. The only reason I like the tease from, say, 6 to 7 is if it allows me to have, like, extra time. Like, it's my way of saying, okay, well, you give me 2.5 minutes here, and then I can have 2.5 minutes. All right, I'm giving you my boss's phone number. You can talk to them about that.
The previous comment about kind of being taken out of context, I would think, isn't that more challenging now with shorter sound bites? That I would think, as a reporter, you've done a whole interview, you know what came before and what came after, but with the pressure to shrink to a short soundbite, you pick what, knowing the whole story, what you think is the salient piece, but sometimes it can be interpreted out of context because you're forced into these quick tweets.
Right. No, good question. She's saying with this sort of short attention span world where sound bites are shorter, sort of the conflict that gives to this idea of taking things out of context. And we have to make decisions. We're putting together 140 characters for a tweet. You really have to make decisions there. But I always think of that really is just a tease, and you can't expect the full story on a Facebook post or a tweet. But even in a story, I mean, the average reporter, we call them packages, but reporter story that you're seeing a reporter out, 1:15, a minute 15, that really is short. So you got to make some decisions about what's most important. And so those are judgment calls. And sometimes the reality is we'll spend 20 minutes interviewing you or more, and then you get like 1 or 2 sound bites. And so I think people, and I understand it, like if I've sat there and interviewed you for 20 minutes and then you see 15 seconds and it's like over before you blink, you sort of feel like you got gypped on it or something, like it didn't quite get out there. And so I think the key is that we have to make sure the sound bites we pick are the ones that sort of express the overall opinion. But it's a challenge. And I think the web gives us opportunities to provide more context that we can, the web, there's no time limit. We can put longer outtakes and interviews, and I think we should be doing more of that, like putting the raw video of a really compelling interview on there so that people who care about it can go back there, or the words, the web script as we call it, that has more context and information than just the minute 30. So I think we do owe it to do a better job at that, to provide that context.
What influence, if any, do the sponsors have with the content of your message?
Sure. It's asking about the influence of sponsors on the message. I can say on my message, they have no influence on what I'm doing. It's a rule in newsrooms that sort of the separation of church and state, that editorial is on one side and the salespeople are on another, and that they shouldn't have any interaction when talking about content. To me, that's something on a higher level. Obviously, you don't want to be doing a story on an advertiser and catch the advertiser off guard, like they didn't know it was coming. I think that's fair that if you're doing a story on an advertiser, which sometimes we don't even know if they are advertisers, but that they should at least know about it and be given a chance to respond to it. But it shouldn't be an incident where they can control the story. And we had, actually, when I was at Fox 25 a few years back, we had done a story on a car dealership, which will go unnamed at this point, but we had done a story and we were looking at someone who was working there that had a connection to the whole pedophile priest scandal, and this car dealership was not happy about this story, and they were a major advertiser, and they threatened to pull the advertising if we went forward with the story, and my managers backed me up. I mean, we had meetings with the car dealership people, and they couldn't understand why we were doing it. And the bottom line was, it was a story. We did the story. They did, in fact, stop advertising, and then they came back. And so I was like, thank you. That's what you want to have, is sort of that backing, where that if the story's legitimate, that advertisers and people who are well respected in the community aren't going to be able to come in and kill those stories. And so I think it really depends on the market. I mean, we're fortunate. This is a great media market, top 10 media market in the country, where we have a lot of really good journalists working in this market. But you go into some of those smaller cities and smaller towns, I think the pressure in those communities to not do stories could be worse. Just want to go to the back since we're going up front.
Yes, something that I've noticed over the last few months, there seems to be an explosion of every local newscast. The news story is labeled breaking news. It's like there's breaking news, like the whole newscast is breaking news.
Right. Right. No, that's a good point. He's raising the fact that if you watch local news, we hear quite often that breaking news, and it's sort of, we're becoming numb to it. Like everything's breaking news. And it's like, well, what, is this breaking news? Or we interrupt this breaking news for some more breaking news? So I think your point is well taken. And I think journalists, we need to watch out for that. I think we need to, if something is breaking, and it really is breaking, and it's important, then that's breaking news. But if you see breaking news at 11 o'clock at night and we're seeing video from the day, that's not breaking news. And so I think all news organizations have to be careful of that. I think that's a fair criticism. Oh, question.
Of the stories that make it, how many were initiated by you or your colleagues or by your research as versus outside sources? And I assume of the outside sources, the majority are anonymous. So what's the split?
So I was asking about where do we get our stories from? Is it stuff that we generate? Yes, it's things that we generate based on, being news consumers and saying we should, the flagger thing, for example. That was a story that I was just, out there and wondering about, because I remember it was such a big deal when it came in. So that was something that I started looking into. Tips, I would say it's a split. I think it's probably a 30-30, 33 and a third split. I'd say, that 1/3 are stories that I'm coming up with, or my producers who I work with are coming up with, and we just have hunches about things, or we decide to submit public records requests about how something's being spent. So those are just things we're always thinking of. We always want to have stories sort of underway. And then we have that third of stories, which are tips. And as I said before, some of those tips can be some of the best stories you get. We wouldn't have known about the DCR party unless someone tipped us off to it. And what I find is the tips lead to tips lead to tips. And so you're sort of trying to make sure you follow up with everyone who gives you a tip, and trying to make sure you follow up with especially the good ones. And then I think the other section are things that are just like what's going on in the news, and things that we sort of decide to look into based on, any particular day. So I think you want to have a good mix. I love good tips, but you also have to be wary of the tips. And for every good tip, you've probably gone through, 25 to 30 bad ones, or even more. And not that they're necessarily bad, but they're not necessarily stories that we're going to take time and invest in. Question.
If you would take a survey over the last 50 years about the percentage of crime stories, fire stories, and taking cats out of the tree stories, would you suggest that the percentage is higher in local news? And if it is, why?
So the question is, if we looked at crime stories, fire stories, sort of like rescuing the cat from a tree story, is the percentage higher now than it has been in the past? I would argue, yes, it probably is higher now than it was in the past. And I think some of that, think about And we have one of the greatest political reporters at WCVB, Janet Wu. She's unbelievable. When I graduated from Emerson and I went up to the State House as this young kid and I happened to get a break working in radio, completely intimidated. And one of the people that intimidated me the most was Janet Wu, because she's tough, she's tough, but she gets answers. And when I went up there, all the TV stations had full-time political reporters up there. No one has a full-time TV political reporter stationed at the State House anymore. Does that mean politics isn't interesting? I don't think that's true. I think it goes back to this whole idea of, what we think the audience wants, and we think they want to hear about the crime and the fires and God, I hope we don't do too many cats rescued in the tree story. So I think it has to do with this sort of evolution of the short attention span. On the other hand, I will say that I'm encouraged by the commitment that TV stations around the country are putting into investigative journalism, because they realize, and I've gone to the investigative reporters and editors, IRE, it's an incredible group of investigative journalists. Their membership is higher than ever. We meet once a year. We have all sorts of seminars, and we're just training. Like, really, you'd be like, wow, there's journalists out there that are really just committed to like trying to do really good stories. And one of the things we've found is that the local news stations realize that investigative journalism is really the only thing that sets them apart. If you're watching 4, 5, 7, 25, whatever you're watching, New England Cable News, which is about to become the new NBC, and you're all going to be confused as to where to get your NBC programming. Stay tuned for that. But if you're watching all of them, they're all covering the fire. They're all covering the crime. We're all covering sort of the same stories. But what makes us different is the investigative stuff. That's sort of original content. And so I think the stations, despite the fact that there's a lot of that coverage that you're talking about, and I'd like to think there's a little less of that type of coverage on WCVB. But I think what sets us apart in general, all the stations, is that investigative content. So yes, we're having higher story count, shorter stories, but there's also a realization that you got to do something different to stand out in the marketplace.
Life and professional life, what effect do you think the media has on this election?
So asking about the effect the media has on this election. I mean, it sure is interesting, isn't it? I've never seen the debates, it's like you could just sit there on your couch and eat popcorn and watch these debates. Or maybe like bury your head in the pillow for some of it. I mean, it's been unprecedented, I think, this election. How nasty it's gotten. I mean, the candidates. I mean, whether you like Donald Trump or you don't like him, I think the where he's taken the conversation and the insults and the bullying is a little scary. I think, and yes, on the other side, you've got Clinton, who has her own baggage, and we've got two candidates, arguably, with a lot of baggage. I know there's a lot of talk now, at least especially from Trump, saying that the media is biased in favor of Hillary Clinton. But he didn't seem to mind all the media attention that allowed him to become the Republican nominee. So I'm not buying that. I do think the talking heads on the 24-hour news channels, I mean, that's where I'm starting to want to just tune out myself. It's like, how much screaming can we handle? And so I think that doesn't help, because we're like, is that journalism when you have 4 people screaming at each other on CNN, and same thing on MSNBC and on Fox, they're all doing the same thing. So I think that clouds it all up for everyone, what's journalism. But I think, at the end of the day, some of the journalists, and we've heard some talk of it, like some people are having sort of these, did the media prop up Donald Trump? And are they now sort of having remorse and they're giving Hillary Clinton more favorable treatment? Why aren't we hearing more about the WikiLeaks stuff? But on the other hand, he's not making it easy to hear about the WikiLeaks stuff when we're seeing, videotapes of him making some pretty crass comments and a string of women coming out. So I just think this election is so, I think we will have a very interesting conversation about this election when it's over, and sort of how the media, once we can kind of sit back and truly evaluate, whether the media screwed up on either side. And I'm not sure what the answer is on that. In the back?
Comment on a question. 40 years ago, the Boston Globe had probably 50, 60 pages of health audit ads. Today, there's virtually nothing.
Right.
And my question is, what's the definition between a journalist and a reporter?
So he made the comment about the ads in the newspaper, how there were so many of them years ago, and they have disappeared, which I think has contributed to this economic problem. I mean, it is a business. Journalism's a business at the end of the day. On the editorial side, I don't like to think of that, but the reality is if they're not making money, they're not going to continue to pay us or expand the staff, that type of thing. And so I'm sorry, refresh me on the second part of the question.
Definition, you talk about journalists.
Right.
What's the difference, journalist and a reporter?
Journalist and a reporter. So I don't think there is a difference. I would like to think that those words are interchangeable, journalist and reporter. I think if you go way old school, people thought of journalist as the print reporter, sort of the newspaper reporter. But I think, especially in the school of journalism, we're teaching our students to be journalists, whether they go into newspapers, TV, online, whatever it is that they do. So I think good journalists are good reporters, and to me, those should be synonymous. Sir? Have I been physically threatened? Not as much. People always ask that, if I've been physically threatened. I mean, I've definitely had some moments. I remember we did a story about a doctor down at the Cape some years ago who was essentially, it turns out he was convicted and was, giving prescription drugs to a lot of addicts, essentially, and even the state essentially said he was operating as a drug dealer. And so in the heat of that story, we went down to talk to him about it. We had already done one of our stories, and his world was sort of, crashing around him as the state turned up the heat. And he did come after me. That was one of the few times I've had someone really come after me. And, I stepped back, and it turned out there was a protest going on, and there was a police officer there. So that was sort of the closest I felt. But I remember when we did that initial story, there were people showing up at the station, some of the addicts who were getting their drugs from this doctor and demanding to see me and threatening to find me. And so there are definitely stories along the way where people aren't happy with us. But, for the most part, I think people realize if they, come after us, we'll probably just end up doing a story on that. So I think for the most part, people accept the stories we do, unless they're in some it is sort of the people that are under the influence of something that worry me the most because their mindset isn't quite there. Sir?
Investigative journalism, there's the national one and then there's the local, what you're doing. It seems as though, at least on the national level, that's dropped in the last 20 years or so. And just want to get your view on, has that happened because of the conglomerates happening during the 90s? FCC allowed media stations, media companies to become larger. Has it become advertisers have pulled out and maybe gone more to the internet? Or is it because of the Obama administration not supporting whistleblowers and doing spying on emails and
Right.
phone calls?
Right, so it's sort of talking about why we've seen, maybe a decline of investigative journalism on the national level over the years. I think it has sort of ebbed and flowed as far as how much investigative journalism has been done, but I still think there's really a lot of good national investigative reporting done and arguably an increase of it. So I think people, sort of like I said on the local level, I think on the national level, news organizations are recognizing that it's important to do it and to stand up to advertisers. 60 Minutes, still one of the highest rated programs on television, and they're doing hard-hitting investigative journalism. That right there says it all to me, that you can do the long stories that people care about, you can take on just about anyone, and the advertisers are going to be there and the audience is going to be there. So I think it's still there, and I am optimistic about the future of investigative journalism. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, one last thing I wanted to do, because we're talking about social media, right? So I figured we better do it. You guys do selfies? I know this looks like a selfie crowd, right? See, now you're going to be able to say you've done a selfie, right? All right. Why don't you guys wave or do something? We got to make this an active selfie, right? I think this is going to get a lot of clicks, all right? So I thank you guys. I'm going to get a couple more followers out of this.
Well, thank you very much for this not only interesting presentation, but the interesting Q&A period. And I just have to try to sneak in one last question, and that is, if you and your colleagues have ever in-depth studied the Kardashian sites to get some presentation tips.
I can tell you I have not, and I will not, but thank you for asking.
Well, regardless, we're very pleased to have had you with us as a presenter today, and as a token of our appreciation, please accept this gift.
Thank you. Thank you all for having me.
Now, before we leave, just a couple of quick reminders. That is, the next Northeastern at Noon event will be a field trip to the Fuller Craft Museum on November 1st. And after that, please avail yourself of Homecoming Week and visit Northeastern at Noon in the Alumni Center on November 12th. Finally, I want to congratulate you as an audience. You are one of the first to have totally wiped out our pastries. That doesn't happen very often. So please enjoy the rest of your day, and thanks again for coming.